welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Are you a parent who is 0 to 6 months in to lowering demands and changing your parenting with a PDA child or teen? If so, this podcast episode is for you. Today, we're going to talk about the messiness of changing your parenting and caregiving. And I want to normalize this and give examples from my own life. Hopefully they'll be a little bit humorous and light because I'm reflecting back on what we went through and how messy and chaotic it was. And this topic came up yesterday in the Paradigm Shift program because one of the parents asked a really good question, which was, my daughter has never actually reached burnout. She sort of hovers around her threshold of tolerance for nervous system activation, but has never gone into full burnout. So does the framework of burnout, recovery, and equilibrium apply to our family? And I loved this question because it gave us an opportunity to reframe a part of this process for parents that I've experienced myself as a mom of a PDAer and also witnessed in now over 1,000 parents that I've worked with either in coaching or the Paradigm Shift. So we sort of reframed it as, burnout is usually the point at which parents recognize that their child is not just having behavioral problems that can be modified by behavioral techniques, right? Because it starts to impact their access to basic needs, and we start to see the behavioral expression of the disability that isn't just, quote, defiance, but it's actually like fight, flight, feral animal, or total shutdown, which is nervous system driven. So even if your child hasn't reached burnout, many of you have reached that point of realization where it's like, oh, something has to change. Like we are hitting rock bottom here and this is not sustainable. So even if your child didn't hit that point, many parents hit that point. So that's when we reevaluate everything, right? The status quo, how we've been parenting, the decisions we're making, how we are with our child, etc. And then the analog to sort of the recovery, if we're looking at the burnout recovery equilibrium cycle in the family system, the recovery period is actually one of relearning your child, lots of experimentation, trial and error. And it's super messy because you're changing everything, right? You're changing the way that you speak to your child. You're changing the logic of how you understand parenting and behavior and education and therapy. You're basically learning a new language of how to communicate non-verbally with your body and your expressions and your tone to signal nervous system safety. You might actually be learning a new way to use language, for example, using declarative language. So this is a time period that lasts more than a day or two, right? It's I would say it on average, it would last 6 to 12 months where you're in this period of figuring things out and feeling awkward and feeling like you don't know if things are going to turn out the way that you want them to. You're also, if you're lowering demands and lowering boundaries and limits, you're going to have that feeling of like, if I give this child an inch, they're going to take 10,000 miles and do 2 trips around the moon because you might have felt that you've been holding back their nature with boundaries and routine and structure and rules, and that any chink in that dam or that armor is just going to be a tsunami of chaos over you. So if you're listening to this as a podcast, feel free to reflect on this. I hope it is, because this has definitely been my experience. It was not like a linear, smooth path where everything just like chugged along A to B to C to D. It was very much ebbs and flows, back and forth, chaos and uncertainty. And then in the same way, children or teens eventually reach their equilibrium or more stability in their nervous system and a window of tolerance, family systems can also reach an equilibrium, but it's only by going through this messiness that we get there. Okay? So what do I mean by an equilibrium in a family system? It means we're making decisions in a different way. It means we're operating from a different logic. It means we're practicing a new way of being. So just like any other learning, like if you're getting a new degree, if you're moving to a foreign country, you're learning a new language, anything, it's going to be awkward and messy, and there will be some funny stories along the way where you're like, holy moly, I can't believe we did that, or I can't believe that happened. So I want to normalize this, and to do so, I'm going to share 5 stories from my personal life with my child, my PDA son, who's now almost 10. But when we really started this practice was around the age of 4.5. So I have many moments of chaos and uncertainty and feeling awkward, and we're going to start with 5 of those stories. So 1 is going to be about declarative language, 1 about lowering demands and introducing new novel things for dopamine, going back to a school environment or camp after being outside of that for a period of time, supporting a special interest, and then finally getting my child sensory input while needing to do it in a low demand way and what this looked like. Okay, so let's start with declarative language. So for those of you who are new to this page, declarative language is simply, instead of asking your child direct questions like, how was your day? Do you want apples for breakfast? Did you feed the dog, etc.? Or imperatives, get your backpack for school, put on your shoes, eat your apples, feed the dog. We're using a type of language that doesn't set off their threat response as much because it's open-ended and it's more of a declarative statement like, I see you have apples still on your plate. Then the child can decide or not if they eat the apple. Or, I noticed the dog hasn't eaten their breakfast yet, or their bowl is empty, right? So it's a totally different way of speaking. It really is. And I remember when I first read Linda K. Murphy's Declarative Language Handbook, which was over 5 years ago now, highly recommend. I was like, okay, I'm all in. I'm going to totally do this declarative language thing. But that's not how I naturally speak. I don't just say statements and leave them hanging in the atmosphere and see if anyone responds. It's not for me a natural way of interacting. So I would often, be about to ask a question or about to ask my PDA son to do something, or even say hey, it's time to go in an imperative way. And then I would catch myself and in my head be like, oh, that's a direct question, or, oh, that is an imperative. That's not how I'm supposed to be speaking to my PDA son. And then I would remember what I learned in the book, and then the gears would shift in my head, and then I would try and formulate the sentence. But often I would just stand there like a doofus, in front of my son being or say one word or sentence that didn't make any sense. And he would just look at me like, what is wrong with you, Mom? Why can't you speak? And this happened a lot, right? I don't know if this has happened for any of you. Feel free to indicate if this is resonating. But for me, changing the way I spoke to my son and also paying attention to am I smiling? Are my eyes kind? What's my tone? Am I below my child? It was an extraordinarily difficult and messy process, just like the same thing when I learned to speak Spanish in a foreign country. When I was immersed in a foreign country, I would make silly mistakes. I would be exhausted. I wouldn't know what to say. I would sometimes just open my mouth and nothing would come out. With a lot of practice and compassion for myself and messiness, I just started using it more naturally. But I had totally shifted the pendulum to where it was the only way I spoke. And often I would have those same awkward moments with the receiver of the language, the declarative language, from a person who is not PDA or didn't need that language accommodation. And they would just be like, what is happening? So for example, when I was really well practiced and it was going well and I was totally on board with declarative language and I could actually say it, I remember sometimes I would go over to my sister's house who lives nearby, and I have 2 nieces and a nephew. And I would just naturally speak using declarative language because in my brain, I was like, oh, I don't want to ask my nephew direct questions like, how's basketball or how's baseball? And I remember after one visit, he told his mom, why does Aunt Casey talk to me like that? Can you tell her not to? Right? Because he was just like, this is such a strange way of speaking, right? And then another funny little anecdote is like, now it's so ingrained in me, I often use it with people besides my son without even realizing it. And so I remember I was doing a podcast interview in the last year and I wanted my husband to help me set up the technology and like make sure the microphones were good. And I kept saying like, I have an interview at 12:30, right? Thinking that like he would remember that his job is to help me set up with the technology. It was like 12:22 and I was like, Jake, why aren't you helping me set up the microphone? And he's like, you never asked me to. Like, what are you talking about? And I realized like, oh, I used declarative language with him, but it didn't register because he and I communicate in a much more direct way. So it is awkward. It is messy. It can be like you don't know how to use it at all. You practice intensively with your PDA and then you're only speaking like that. And people are like, what are you doing? So that's my first story about declarative language. The next story happened when we were really leaning into the concepts of lowering demands and not having as much boundaries around things we would normally have because we were reevaluating, okay, when do we actually have to say no? When do we actually have to put limits for safety and health and well-being versus just like not wanting things to get messy or disordered or chaotic, right? And I was also trying to change my relationship with my son where there was more humor and playfulness and fun. And so it was a real push for me to do that because I felt so tight and so anxious and like really wanted structure for my brain. That's like my access need is like things to be orderly, right? But I remember the boys taking a bath. And at the time I had two friends from Colombia who were living with us to help me sort of like get myself out of burnout and sometimes help with the kids. And they were trying to give my son a bath. And I had told them like, let's lower the demands. Like if they want to put cooking things in the bath, if they want to put food coloring in the bath, if they want to use daddy's shaving cream, like it's all good. Like, let's just have fun and not worry about it. And I remember, I think I was trying to like cook nearby while they were in the bathroom right next to us. And my son just kept insisting on more and more bubbles and more water. And like, I could see they were like sort of splashing things over into the bathroom. And of course my instinct was like, you're getting everything wet. Like, this is so chaotic. But I was like really working on like not setting limits that I didn't have to. But then ultimately, like, I just remember this moment where I looked up and it was like the entire bathroom was flooded and part of the kitchen was flooded. And it was like, I was like, oh no, like this is an unsafe situation. And then my PDAer was just like so hyperactive and constantly in manic motion. So he like ran, luckily he didn't slip, but he ran through the water with his towel. And then his little brother, who was only like 2 at the time, came running through too and just like skidded naked across all of this water in the kitchen. And I remember just being like, oh my gosh, I'm such a terrible mom. Like, I'm trying to do this, but like, I'm hurting my baby because he's like slipping on the water. I remember that moment of being like, I'm trying to lower demands and I'm trying not to set boundaries that I don't need to, but like, look what happened, right? So it's like, it's this very messy experimentation as we're trying to learn how to do this. And I'm included in that, okay? So then, when we tell stories over long timelines, it can seem like easy peasy, right? Like, okay, this happened. They were out of school for like 1.5 years and then they went back to school, or like, they sort of couldn't access public school. So then we found a private school, like done and done. But I want to just tell you a little bit more about the messiness of going back to a school environment after being home during COVID for like over a year. And, he would go 2 hours a couple times a week to this co-op preschool where I was there and my sister was there. And it was like he could get that special interest of other kids, but it wasn't like kindergarten because he couldn't access kindergarten. That was online. And then it was like very chaotic, some days on, some days off. And then when he went back to school, public school in the fall, like he just refused and couldn't access it. So I was at the point that many of you will reach or have reached or did reach, which is like the cost of pushing him to go to school is so much for his nervous system that he's starting to go back into burnout. He's not eating. He's having panic attacks every night. This isn't going to work, right? After a year and a half of advocacy and like having a service dog that they didn't want to come to school, all the things, right? So we were trying out a school environment at a private school. And I remember I asked the school if I could sit outside his classroom for the entire day so that if he needed me, he could come get me. And so I could observe what was happening because I wasn't sure if it was going to work and if we were going to need to continue to unschool. And I remember sitting outside the classroom and people just like walking by and I was just sitting there for like the entire day, for days and days. And then I finally started to feel comfortable enough for me to go home, right? But, I gave the teachers my phone number and I was like, it's all good. And I remember that I had just started coaching, right? Like just started coaching. And I remember I was on a coaching call and I missed a call. And keep in mind, like I was working very, very specific time periods. It's not like I had full-time work or anything. I was just trying to like eke out pockets of time where I could actually feel like I was making a contribution and it was intellectually stimulating, etc. because I had left my career. And I remember I got off the call and I had messages and was told that he had smashed into a rock wall because he was doing his sensory seeking and activation. He wasn't like having a panic attack, but he was just in that manic space. And he ran directly into a climbing wall. And so it turns out he broke 2 ribs and a collarbone the second week in his private school and had to be home for 10 days, right? So of course I'm like, oh my gosh, I just started like this very small coaching practice. And, the first day of the second week, I'm like in the ER and not knowing if it's too activating for him to go back to school, right? And so all we can do in those moments is like take it one day at a time. And so reflecting back, where I am now, it's like, yeah, I have a business and I work much more, but at that decision point, I had no idea how things were going to turn out, right? There's a lot of uncertainty and messiness. And then when he had his service dog, his second year, I remember my husband and I had to take shifts again, sitting outside the classroom, this time 3 to 4 hours a day for 3 months, every day, in order to support the training of the service dog and take him out to go poop and pick up his poop. So like, yes, my son was in school, but like, so were my husband and I, right? And so it's messy. Like this was not a situation where it's like plug and play, like all good. I don't have to be hands-on anymore. And of course we've evolved to a place where things are much more steady and certain, but it was not like that when we were trying new things, right? Fourth, I want to talk a tiny bit. This is just a funny story about supporting a special interest. So one of the things about the service dog is that my son refused to help take care of it and often did not want to follow his training, right? So it's like, oh, when doggo does this, we need to correct him in this way. And my son would do the opposite because PDA, right? And so we had to figure out ways to lower the demands and scaffold him, but also knowing that dogs were his special interest, his lifelong love of dogs, and therefore it was regulating to him. So how could we look at the special interest as an entry point to his growth, right? So one of the ideas he had was to earn money by running a business, helping dogs, right? So taking them on walks and feeding them and like, checking in on them if the dog owner was out of town, letting them out to pee, etc. So he and my husband hung up a bunch of signs with my husband's phone number at the dog park here locally. And we joke because what ended up happening was like my husband essentially was running a dog walking business, meaning he was receiving the texts and phone calls, doing all the scheduling. He would go get the dogs and then my son would like play with them for an hour, sometimes even refuse to walk them. So my husband would do it. And then he would take the dog back and communicate with the owner. And often like on Fridays at this point, we were going out on a date and he would have to like go back to the dog's house late at night, like 10 p.m. and let the dog out and pick up their poop. So like, it was like 10% my son and 90% my husband, right? But of course, my PDA son got all the compensation for it and would say things like, Daddy, I'm doing all of it. You aren't even helping, right? And we would just chuckle because it's like so obvious that my husband's the one actually running this business. But through the PDA lens, this is absolutely worth it because it was a special interest. It was regulating. It was something that would get him out, get him exercise. He felt great self-concept and has experience now with entrepreneurship at a very small level. So like these are the trade-offs we make, but it's not, when I post something on Instagram of like, I remember a couple of years ago, I would try and include some of these anecdotes, but like sometimes I would just post a picture of like my son running his dog business, but behind the scenes, there's a lot more messiness going on, right? Even for me and still like to this day. So the final story before we wrap up is when my son was in burnout, one of the things that we had to do was to bounce his body or swing his body for like hours, bounce his body on a trampoline or swing him for hours because it was too much of a demand and his nervous system was in burnout to like pump the swings or jump himself. But he needed the sensory input because he's a sensory seeker. He needed that proprioceptive input to feel where his body was in space. So one of the practices I had was to, after dinner, go out with him on the trampoline with his stuffed doggie, which is, special interest. And we would do things like throw the doggie up in the air and I would bounce his body and he would try and catch it. Or one of the other things we do I would bounce him and we would talk about transformations of superheroes where he's like, okay, Catwoman and Spider-Man. And then I would be like, Cat Spider. And we would like go back and forth doing this for hours. But one evening we were jumping on the trampoline and he threw the doggie over the fence of the neighbors, which was very high. We went to the front door and we were knocking on the door kind of frantically, but they weren't home because he needs the dog to sleep. And so he and I, he started to freak out and I'm like, we're going to solve the problem. I have some ideas, right? But in my head, I'm like, holy moly, what's going to happen? So he and I are dragging the step ladder. We're getting rakes out. We're trying to get the dog pooper scooper. We are just trying to hang over this fence and get his doggie. And eventually we did. It took a lot of effort and awkwardness. But I remember it fondly as this moment of he actually helped me with the rake and the step ladder and the ideas, and we were collaboratively problem solving. And that was one of the first times that he would actually do that, right? Because even 2 years in occupational therapy before that, he would have an idea and he wouldn't help bring over the crash pad or help set things up or put them away. It was just we had to lower all those demands so he could engage in the occupational therapy. And we solved the problem together, which is it's a memory that banks in his system, and it's a nervous system regulation of Mom and I can work together. We solved the problem. It's okay, right? That's a memory. So I'll stop there with my stories, but I hope these 5 stories help you realize the following. That as you lower demands and start to lower boundaries and view them as more flexible rather than static rules, and you reevaluate the way that you are with your child, it is going to be super messy. Okay? It's going to be messy. It's going to be awkward. You're going to feel anxiety. It's going to be uncertain. And especially for those of you who are more linear or anxious or have access needs around structure and organization, like this is going to feel exquisitely difficult because it will be messy. That's just the nature of it, because you're going from structure, routine, rewards, consequences, and the control and authority of the parent into you haven't reached the other paradigm with your child. You're in the middle. And so like they're learning your new way of being, you're practicing being a different way, and it's going to feel terrifying, right? Because you're like, well, what if this is not actually the right way? And what if, I lower these demands or reduce these limits and then we never reach an equilibrium, and in fact, it goes the total opposite direction. And like, I'll be honest with you, the vast majority of parents I work with, they get to an equilibrium with the approach that I teach, but that doesn't mean every single person, right? Just like anything, like medications don't work for every single person, therapies don't work for every single person. And so the responsibility, but also freedom of the parents is in the experimentation, right? Because as you start to try things, you confront your own uncertainty and you get to observe without judgment how things are shifting in your relationship and your child's access to basic needs, their nervous system. And what comes with experimentation and trial and error is the knowledge that you can always pivot, right? You can always adjust. It's not a set of rules or a dogma. And there's a lot of agency in that for you as a parent. But as you start to release some of the control in this experimentation, there's a vulnerability that your child will also sense because you're moving away from like being the authority who knows everything and is always in control into a more equal mentorship, like we're just figuring it out together type of energy. And for a PDAer, that is going to produce a sense of felt safety over time because one of the things that sets off their nervous system is the neuroception around you being above them. Okay. And as you grow and observe your child in real time of like, okay, what happens when I do this? Like, how does their body look? Are they screaming less? Like, are they eating more? How's their sleep? And it might get worse before it gets better in the sense of like, the behavior seems worse and, they're needing to co-sleep or whatever, but you're in that middle period of figuring it out. And if you don't try, if you don't change anything, you will never know. You will never get that new data about your child of like, what does work for our family? And how can we figure out a way to have a sustainable, stable, peaceful home environment over the long term? And so, what I teach here and what I provide in the program, the Paradigm Shift program, is structure, language, and the ability to reduce that feeling of chaos, and also with mentors that will tell you it's completely normal. If you're within the first 6 months of doing this, it's going to feel like this. We've walked hundreds and hundreds of families through this process. We've been through it ourselves. But, even if you're in the program, you will feel uncertain. You will feel like it's messy. You will feel scared. And we will give you the tools in order to provide some control and structure to move through it. But we will not be able to eliminate the nature of the experimentation. And that's why we have a group of parents and experts and mentors and guest speakers about the nervous system so that you can have the support to go through this in a way that's not traumatizing. So that is what I have to say today. All right, my friends, I'm jumping off. It was nice to speak with you. Bye. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.